There's a CIA document that actually has the transcript of a remote viewing session where the remote viewer was asked to look at what happened to Mars just before a cataclysm that occurred up to 1 million years ago. And Joseph McMoneagle was the remote viewer who looked at Mars at the time of it undergoing some kind of planetary catastrophe, probably associated with the exploding superplanet. What he saw was that these surviving Martians getting on these spacecraft, on these planetary arcs, and evacuating to another planet which had a very equatorial region with volcanoes and so forth. This is where the Martians evacuated to.
So after the great destruction of Tiamat and Maldak was damaged beyond repairing itself, these pre-Adamites took the moon as a giant ship, a giant conveyance. It was also in the vicinity of Tiamat. They hijacked the moon and flew it to the Earth. And they tidal locked it with the Earth to keep it in place. And they lived on the moon for thousands of years, observing the culture, the development of civilization going on the planet below, and at the same time having certain colonies down where they knew where ancient builder race remnants were.
The survivors of the catastrophe who were inside Earth's moon then suffered another massive cataclysm 55,000 years ago, and we now know that this was caused by a solar flash, a massive emission of light, energy, and matter from the sun. Part of the problem when you have these solar flashes is that in addition to an enormous heating of the atmospheres and even the surfaces of planets, which could be up to 1,000 degrees Celsius, we're literally talking about a heat that can melt stone. You also have the sun throwing off a great deal of debris, a great deal of chunky, molten material that will physically strike the surface of planets and moons. This solar flash is what now is being called a micronova. A supernova is where a star completely explodes and nothing is left except for a red dwarf or a brown dwarf. Whereas the micronova causes an incredible flash to occur, but the star maintains its stability and structure in the aftermath. The latest NASA research that's only come out in the last year proves that there are multiple documented examples of micronovas everywhere we look. This is not uncommon. Stars do this naturally, and it is a very normal aspect of a given solar system.
So after these pre-Adamite groups from Tiamat and Maldak had moved to the moon, they were there for thousands of years. And as we know now, the solar system goes through a cycle of destruction. We had another solar event that wreaked havoc on the moon.
It would appear, based on historical records, that the people living inside the moon did not know that this solar flash was going to happen. It was being kept secret from them by their own governmental elite. I once had an insider who we call Bruce, who described that his faction of the military-industrial complex was only able to go inside these inner passageways in the moon a total of 6 times on covert missions that they sent people in through. And they found a vast amount of control systems, where you walk into a room, the lights come on, you have these big giant screens that are very wide with displays on them, there are control surfaces in front of them, and it was gorgeous. And this goes on for miles and miles and miles, countlessly. Everywhere you look, there are these bodies that have not been cleaned up, because the amount of square footage inside the moon is so vast, and the amount of depth is so vast, that huge regions inside the moon have never been cleaned up, never been explored, and there is a horrible stench from these decaying dead bodies.
And the remnants that survived that new catastrophe of pre-Adamites loaded up into their last 3 motherships from their home planets. And they flew those down to Earth. They were damaged, and it was more of a crash landing. Later on, when our secret space program located the remnants of these ships under the ice in Antarctica, they named them the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. So when these three motherships landed, the pre-Adamites that inhabited them began to cannibalize the technology and materials to build out a great civilization. And this civilization would later be known as Atlantis.
Another important historical reference to existence of advanced civilizations is Plato's description of Atlantis. He described an island continent with incredibly advanced technologies, with a wonderful canal system and concentric rings, that this was something that was built in a series of islands, and it was the center of a vast empire that existed beyond the Pillars of Hercules. And many people speculate as to where Atlantis is, but I believe Atlantis is probably the western portion of Antarctica, especially around the Palmer Peninsula, that this was, prior to 9700 BC, actually ice-free.
They landed in Antarctica, where there is apparently a pyramid that, if you could see it without the ice covering it, is much larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. That pyramid was a landmark for the surface feature of something that is predominantly underground. There are enormous ancient builder race ruins underneath the surface in Antarctica. The progenitors crash landed in Antarctica, but at the time, the Earth was on a different axial tilt, and Antarctica was not covered by ice.
In the 15th century, the Perry-Reese map was produced, and what it shows is the coastline of North and South America, Africa, as well as what appears to be Antarctica, the Palmer Peninsula, as well as part of New Schwabenland. Now, this was well before Antarctica was discovered. When we explore the idea of Antarctica being ice-free, we have to look at the evidence of pole shifts. And the person who's most associated with theories of pole shifts is Charles Hapgood, who wrote a book called The Earth's Shifting Crust. And his book was supported by Albert Einstein, who wrote the foreword to it, and basically believed that Hapgood was correct in terms of his theory, how the pole shifts approximately 40 degrees from one age to another age.
This pre-Adamite group, while their civilization was thriving on Tiamat and Maldek, they became very, very proficient geneticists. And they brought that with them to the Earth. And when they got to the Earth, they found inhabitants that were humanoid beings. They then started to play around with the genetics of these early humans and develop them into a number of different species, including hybrids with animals that they used as a slave force.
So the people who crash landed in what we now call Antarctica began to introduce their DNA into the genetic material of humans from Earth. And those people who were cloned out did have the elongated skull physiology. Apparently, there were two royal lineages that go all the way back to the source planets themselves, and they have slightly different features. When you look at the elongated skulls, some of them have a distinct bun-like bump that looks almost like there is a ball on the surface of their head there, whereas other elongated skulls have a smooth slope without that bun-like protrusion. This apparently refers to the two major types of extraterrestrial lineages from this exploded planet.
So the pre-Adamites thrived for thousands of years and became the Atlanteans. 11,800 years ago, our sun had another micronova, and this was one of the more severe micronovas. And as the ejecta from the micronova left the sun, it impacted the moon and also Earth.
According to the maps Charles Hapgood supplied and ice core samples, two British researchers, Rand Flem-Ath and his wife Rose Flem-Ath, wrote a book called Atlantis Under the Ice. What that book shows is that West Antarctica the Palmer Peninsula in particular was actually 40 degrees north of its present location in the temperate zone. And that approximately 9700 BC, this is when this coincides with what Plato described as the time Atlantis collapsed into the ocean, that this is when the pole shift occurred. And so that coincided with that region of Antarctica moving down towards the South Pole and it being frozen over, and everything that was in that continent was flooded and flash frozen. And so according to the maps and the ice core samples, what we can see about Antarctica is that indeed West Antarctica has been ice-free for significant periods because the ice core samples only go back several thousand years at most. Whereas when we look at the ice core samples from East Antarctica, these are millions of years old.
When the Earth shifted on its axis, it caused Antarctica to move from a lush tropical zone to a colder region. And it did so quickly that it flash froze the waves that were leaping over the continent.
Several years ago, the CIA declassified a document that was authored by a geologist by the name of Chan Thomas. That document is called the Adam and Eve Story, and it describes a cataclysmic series of events associated with a pole shift of up to 90 degrees, where the Antarctic and the Arctic, those both flip approximately 90 degrees so that they are now at the equatorial zones of the planet.
With a rumble so low as to be inaudible, growing and fuming into a thunderous roar, the earthquake starts. Only it's not like any earthquake in recorded history. In California, the mountains shake like ferns in a breeze. The mighty Pacific rears back and piles up into a mountain of water 2 miles high and starts its race eastward. With a force of 1,000 armies, the wind attacks. Within 3 hours, the fantastic wall of water moves across the continent, burying the wind-ravaged land under 2 miles of seething water coast to coast. Central America suffers the same cannonade. South America finds the Andes not high enough to stop the cataclysmic violence pounded out by water in her berserk rage. In less than a day, Ecuador, Peru, Western Brazil are shaken madly by the devastating earthquake, burned by Mother Earth fire, buried under cubic miles of torrential Pacific seas, and then turned into a frozen hell. Everything freezes. Man, beast, plant, and mud are all rock hard in less than 4 hours. Europe cannot escape the onslaught. Western Africa and the sands of the Sahara vanish in nature's wrath. The area bounded by the Congo, South Africa, and Kenya suffers only severe earthquakes and wind. Survivors there marvel at the sun standing still in the sky for nearly half a day. As the Arctic basin leaves its polar home, eastern Siberia, Manchuria, China, and Burma are subjected to the same annihilation as South America. Wind, earth fire, inundation, and freezing. The Bay of Bengal Basin, just east of India, is now at the North Pole. The Pacific Ocean, just west of Peru, is at the South Pole. Australia is the new unexplored continent in the world's temperate zone, with only a few handfuls of survivors populating its vastness. The cataclysm has done its work well and drives the pitiful few who survive into a new Stone Age. Once more, the Earth has shifted its shelf, with the poles moving almost to the equator in a fraction of a day. Again, the atmosphere and oceans, refusing to change direction with the Earth's shell, have wiped out almost all life. After this tumble, we'll join Noah, Adam and Eve, Atlantis, Mu, and Olympus.